The Arizona sun blazed fiercely across the open desert, its golden rays swallowing the land in heat and silence. Richard Hayes gripped the steering wheel of his old Ford truck, the air conditioner long since dead, and the radio playing faint country tunes that cracked through the static. A retired Air Force officer, Richard had spent the last few years trying to find peace after losing his only son, Michael, in Afghanistan. The endless drives through the desert had become his escape, his way to silence the ghosts that followed him home. But that afternoon, fate had other plans. He was miles away from the nearest town when he noticed a strange shape near a rusted water tank. At first, he thought it was a stray animal, maybe a coyote or a fallen bird, but as he slowed the truck, his instincts told him something wasn't right. The figure didn't move like an animal, it barely moved at all. Richard parked the truck and stepped out into the burning air. The smell of sand and rust filled his lungs as he approached cautiously, boots crunching over the dry earth. Then he froze. Lying there, half covered in dust, was a young boy. The child couldn't have been more than 10 years old. His skin was sunburned, his lips cracked, and his tiny hands clutched an empty canteen. His clothes were torn and his body trembling. Richard knelt beside him, his voice trembling as he asked, "Hey, kid, can you hear me?" The boy opened his eyes weakly, dark eyes, deep and ancient like the desert itself. He tried to speak, but only a whisper came out, a few words in Apache that Richard couldn't understand. Without another thought, Richard scooped him into his arms and carried him to the truck. The drive to the nearest clinic felt endless. Dust trailed behind as Richard pushed the truck to its limits. Every few seconds, he glanced at the boy, afraid he might stop breathing. The boy's head rested against his shoulder, his heartbeat faint but steady. Richard kept murmuring softly, "Hang on, son. You're safe now. Just a little longer." The words came naturally, too naturally. They reminded him of how he used to talk to Michael when he was small and scared. For a moment, Richard wasn't driving through the Arizona desert, he was back home, holding his own son again. When they finally reached the clinic in Prescott, Richard burst through the doors, shouting for help. The nurses rushed the boy into a room while Richard stood by helplessly, watching the doctors move around him like ghosts. Hours passed before one of them came out, wiping sweat from his forehead. "He's severely dehydrated," the doctor said. "But he's stable now. You brought him just in time." Relief washed over Richard, but it was mixed with something else, curiosity. Who was this boy, and how had he ended up alone in the middle of nowhere? Richard stayed by the boy's bedside all night. The monitors beeped softly, and the desert wind whispered against the window. The boy's face looked peaceful in sleep, but there was something haunting about him, like he carried memories far older than his age. Occasionally, he would murmur words in his sleep, Apache phrases that sounded like prayers. Once, he even said a name, Atsidi. Richard didn't know what it meant, but it stayed with him, echoing in his mind long after the boy quieted again. At dawn, a nurse brought Richard a cup of coffee. "You should rest, sir," she said kindly. But Richard couldn't leave. He sat there staring at the boy, feeling a strange connection he couldn't explain. He remembered his son's last letter before his death, how Michael had written about finding peace with the local tribes during his service near the reservation. It was as if the boy lying in that bed was a living piece of the mystery Michael had left behind. Richard felt his heart tighten. By the second day, the boy had regained some strength. He could open his eyes and drink water, but he still wouldn't speak English. Every time Richard asked a question, the boy would look away, almost as if afraid to answer. A translator from a nearby reservation was called in, but before she arrived, the boy did something unexpected. He reached for Richard's hand and placed a small object in his palm, a silver dog tag, tarnished and scratched. When Richard turned it over, his breath caught. The name engraved on it was Michael Hayes. His son's tag. The same one that had been buried with him. Richard's world stopped. His eyes filled with disbelief as he stared at the boy, who simply looked back with quiet understanding. "Where did you get this?" Richard asked, his voice trembling. The boy didn't answer. He only whispered something soft and closed his eyes again. For hours, Richard sat there in silence, gripping the dog tag so tightly that his hand shook. The impossible weight of memory and mystery pressed down on him. That night, the boy's condition seemed to worsen suddenly. Nurses rushed in as his breathing became shallow, and Richard was forced out of the room. The hours that followed were a blur of fear and prayer. When dawn broke again, the doctor came out, his expression uncertain. "He's stable now," he said slowly, but something strange happened. He kept saying your name, Mr. Hayes, over and over. Richard didn't know what to say. The boy had never been told his name. Unable to sleep, Richard walked out of the clinic into the quiet morning. The desert stretched endlessly before him, the rising sun painting it gold. Somewhere out there, he felt, were the answers, about the boy, about his son, and about the strange thread of destiny that tied them together. He looked at Michael's dog tag in his hand and whispered to the wind, "I'll find the truth, I promise." The wind seemed to carry his words away, across the dunes, towards something waiting just beyond sight. 4 days later, when Richard returned to the clinic, the boy was gone. No one saw him leave. All that remained was the empty hospital bed and the faint smell of sage in the air. And that's when Richard knew, his journey into the desert wasn't over. It had only just begun. 4 days had passed since Richard last saw the boy. The hospital room where the child had lain was now cold and empty, with nothing left except a folded blanket and the faint scent of desert dust. No one at the clinic had seen him leave. The nurse swore she had checked on him moments before sunrise, but when she returned, the bed was empty. Richard stood in the doorway, feeling a hollow ache in his chest. He had promised to protect the boy, but now he was gone, just as mysteriously as he had appeared. That evening, Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something was calling him back to the desert. The silence of the house pressed against him like a weight. He sat at the table staring at his son's photo, the same image that had anchored him through years of grief. But now, a strange connection lingered in his thoughts, the dog tag, the boy's whispers, and the haunting way he had said Richard's name. It didn't feel like coincidence. It felt like fate was dragging him towards something he wasn't meant to ignore. He packed a flashlight, a canteen, and his old army jacket, then drove out into the endless stretch of red sand. The road dissolved behind him as the horizon swallowed the sun. Miles passed before he reached the spot where he'd first found the boy, a lonely patch of earth near a broken water tank. The wind carried the scent of sage and smoke. At first glance, the place seemed empty, but as he walked further, the beam of his flashlight caught something: charred ground, black and tense, and scattered remains of old belongings. Richard knelt beside the ashes, his hands brushing over what looked like a burned doll, a rusted pot, and fragments of fabric. It wasn't just a camp, it was a home that had been destroyed. The thought struck him hard: had the boy come from here? Who had burned it? The desert answered only with silence. He stood there for a long time, his heart heavy with a sense of unseen tragedy. Then, faintly, he thought he heard voices on the wind, soft, rhythmic chants in Apache, fading as quickly as they came. By the time Richard returned home, the sky had turned crimson and the air smelled like rain. He parked the truck and sat for a moment, staring at the horizon. There was something different about the air, like the calm before a storm. He stepped onto his porch, his boots echoing against the wood, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. His pulse quickened. It was too late for visitors, and his home sat miles from the nearest neighbor. When he opened the door, he froze. Standing before him were 3 native Apache women, their faces marked with both strength and sorrow. They wore long dresses faded by time and travel, and their dark eyes glimmered in the fading light. The eldest, her silver hair braided neatly, stepped forward and spoke softly, "You are the man who found the child." Richard nodded silently, still trying to understand what was happening. The woman lowered her head in respect. "You saved what was left of our bloodline." Richard didn't know how to respond. His mind was spinning. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. The woman reached into a small woven bag and pulled out a folded piece of fabric. She held it out with both hands, her voice trembling slightly as she said, "He wanted you to have this." Richard unfolded it slowly, and froze. It was a shirt. His late son's army shirt. The same one Michael had been buried in years ago. His heart stopped. How did you get this?" he whispered. The woman's eyes softened. "The boy carried it when you found him. He told us you would understand." Richard's throat tightened as tears filled his eyes. His mind flashed with memories: Michael in his uniform, smiling proudly before deployment, the folded flag handed to him at the funeral, the long nights spent wondering if his son had felt alone at the end. Now, standing on his porch, it was as if his boy had spoken to him once more, through the voice of a child he had tried to save. The other 2 women stood silently, their faces calm but their eyes full of centuries of pain. The eldest continued, "He was not just a child of our tribe. He was the last to carry the blood of those who prayed to the wind and spoke to the spirits. When you found him, he was already between worlds. The spirit of your son walked with him. They were bound by loss, and by light." Her words washed over Richard like a tide, soft but heavy with truth. For a long moment, no one spoke. The desert wind moved gently through the porch, lifting the edges of the old shirt in Richard's trembling hands. He felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, a peace he hadn't known since the day he lost Michael. It was as if the boy had carried not just a message, but forgiveness, closure, and connection between 2 worlds that rarely met. "He saved me more than I saved him," Richard whispered, his voice breaking. The women nodded in silence. The eldest placed a hand over her heart and said softly, He is with the ancestors now, and your son walks with him. Both are free. Then, as quietly as they had arrived, they turned and began walking down the dirt road, their silhouettes fading into the twilight. Richard stood there watching until the last trace of them disappeared into the dark. The desert was silent again, but it no longer felt empty. Richard sat on the porch long after night fell, the stars stretching endlessly above him. He held Michael's shirt close, the fabric warm from his hands. In the distance, the coyotes sang, and the wind carried a whisper through the sagebrush, a voice that sounded like both the boy and his son, saying, "Thank you." Tears rolled down Richard's face, but for the first time in years, they weren't from pain. They were from peace. The boy had vanished, but his message had been delivered. Love never truly dies, it just finds another way to return home.